It's a lot of pinch me moments right now because I'm so busy with so many different things. And for each of those projects, as you mentioned, the show or the most important thing that I work on every day, my practice is trying to really integrate it. To integrate, like we say, like, you have to be thankful. Like, yes, you're thankful. Like, yeah, I'm thankful, but I have to go to this next meeting. It's like, no, can you just take a minute to really like signal and cue that, oh, happy, thank you, more please. This feels really good.
Welcome to the Retrover channel, where we break down the real story behind the headlines. If you found this deep dive insightful, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. At dawn on February 3rd, the British Crown made a move no one had seen in modern times. 2 passports were frozen. Not criminals, not fugitives, 2 young children, born into one of the most watched families on the planet. The decision didn't come with flashing cameras or bold headlines, no press conference, no warning. It happened quietly, behind palace doors, like a switch flipped in the dark. Inside royal systems, it showed up as a simple procedural lock, a technical safeguard on paper. But in constitutional terms, this was serious business. It signaled that officials believed the children's safety, identity, and long-term stability needed protection. That kind of call is not made lightly. Once that determination is reached, it carries weight and consequence. For Prince Harry, it marked a moment that could not simply be reversed or brushed aside. This came just when he thought the toughest chapter had closed. A custody agreement had been signed, lawyers stepped back, public tension seemed to cool down, at least on the surface. There was talk of fragile peace, of parallel parenting, of moving forward without drama. It looked calm, it sounded calm, but looks can be deceiving. Because that agreement did not bring the steady ground many expected. Behind palace walls, concerns started rising fast. Officials noticed something that didn't involve interviews, lawsuits, or public accusations. It was quieter than that. It was absence, silence, a pattern of withdrawal with no clear explanation and no visible trail. And in royal circles, silence can speak louder than words. By the time the Crown stepped in, this was no longer described as a simple custody disagreement. The language turned colder, more formal. Officials reportedly spoke about identity concerns, emotional strain, and the risk of a disconnect from established heritage. That is serious territory. At that point, the Crown did not wait around. The passport freeze was not framed as punishment. It was presented as a preventative safeguard. Under long-standing royal guardianship principles, when there is concern about a child's stability within their historical and constitutional framework, action is required. Not suggested, required. There was no public announcement, no press conference, just silence on the outside. But internally, the message was clear and direct. The Crown had shifted from watching closely to stepping in directly, and almost right after that, another shock hit. According to sources close to the situation, Prince Harry began making serious accusations that reportedly left even experienced palace officials stunned. Claims involving Meghan Markle, claims involving Prince Andrew, heavy names, heavy statements. What raised eyebrows was the timing. These claims were not made during negotiations, not during mediation, not when discussions were active. They surfaced only after authority over the children had started moving beyond his control. That timing sparked intense questions behind the scenes. Why speak up then? Why wait until the monarchy had already triggered one of its strongest safeguards? Those questions still hang in the air. What appears clear is this: the passport freeze was not the start of the crisis. It was a sign that concerns had been building for months, and what officials reportedly uncovered next tightened the situation even more, leaving very little space for compromise. The first alert did not come from inside palace walls. It reportedly came from a school. On January 31st, administrators at 2 private schools in Santa Barbara noticed something unusual. Archie and Lily did not show up for the start of the new term. At first, it seemed routine. Children miss days, families adjust travel plans, life happens. But by midday, concern began to grow. There had been no formal withdrawal notice, no transfer request, no explanation from a parent, legal representative, or school liaison. For institutions responsible for child welfare and documentation, that silence was not small. It broke normal protocol. Even more concerning, the schools reportedly had no information about a new institution, no destination listed, no academic continuity plan, nothing on file. Under normal policy, that kind of gap raises red flags fast. What started as a routine absence quickly shifted into internal review. Within hours, the tone changed from casual to urgent. Staff tried to reach Meghan Markle directly. Emails reportedly were unanswered. Calls were not returned. Messages left with administrative contacts received no reply. The schools then contacted the court-appointed mediator responsible for overseeing the children's welfare under the custody agreement. That office at that time had no record of any approved educational change. At that point, the situation crossed an important line. When children are absent from an educational system without explanation and no guardian can be reached, it stops being just a private family issue. It becomes a safeguarding matter. By that evening, alerts were reportedly issued. The concern reached officials connected to international child welfare coordination, including the UK liaison team assigned to monitor cross-jurisdictional protections.
Worse. Just watching the world go by, talking and talking. And I think, well, to answer, when you're saying someone writes in saying, how do you make friends as an adult? It's such a great question. Depth of friendship at the onset, I think it's kind of when you're on a plane, and I remember back in the day, you'd sit next to a stranger and sometimes you'd feel more comfortable telling your life story to a complete as part of your day-to-day. Immediate trust, but I guess the difference is for us, it's just become so lasting.
What reportedly surfaced next deepened the tension. There were no travel notices on record, no updated residency filings, no formal documentation indicating relocation, homeschooling arrangements, or private tutoring enrollment. Even more unusual, there were no newly registered medical providers connected to the children during that period. When records were reviewed for continuity of care, officials began to see a pattern that raised even more serious questions. Several routine medical appointments were reportedly cancelled back-to-back, not postponed, not rescheduled, fully cancelled. No follow-up notes, no updated care plan. For experienced child welfare professionals, that combination raised serious concern. School attendance had stopped, medical continuity appeared interrupted, and the listed parent of record could not be reached. By February 2nd, internal communication reportedly shifted in tone. What started as measured concern began to feel urgent. The language inside official correspondence changed fast. Words like oversight and coordination were replaced with terms such as withdrawal and obstruction. That shift signaled something bigger was unfolding behind closed doors. Behind the scenes, efforts were made to figure out whether this was a temporary disruption or a deliberate decision. Officials reportedly checked for emergency explanations. Was there an illness, a private security issue, a sudden relocation for safety reasons? But as hours passed, no formal explanation was logged, no emergency medical disclosed, no official notice filed. There was only silence. Inside Windsor, briefings began circulating among senior figures. The focus of discussion reportedly moved away from the children's location and toward a deeper concern. Why had multiple support systems been disconnected at the same time? Education, healthcare, legal communication channels. Each change alone might have been viewed as manageable, but stacked together, they formed a pattern that demanded attention. A palace source later described the atmosphere in stark terms. The mood was no longer cautious, it was tense, controlled, and deeply unsettled. Officials reportedly began to see this not as simple negligence, but something more structured, something that looked planned. By the time Princess Anne was informed, the matter had already moved beyond quiet diplomacy. It was no longer framed as parental discretion. It became a serious safeguarding question about whether two children had been placed into an unexplained gap in oversight. And under royal protocol, once that possibility is raised, hesitation is not an option. The next step was not casual conversation, it was formal documentation. An emergency meeting was reportedly arranged outside normal scheduling channels. No advance memo, no broad briefing. Senior aides were told to clear a room inside Windsor Castle quickly. Phones were set aside, staff were dismissed. The tone shifted from concern to controlled urgency. What followed was described not as an open debate, but as a structured presentation. Princess Anne entered carrying a red folder. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as instantly serious. The folder was sealed and marked with language typically reserved for high-level constitutional matters. The phrases were direct: immediate custodial breach, maternal withdrawal. There was no soft wording, no vague language. She placed the file before the king and remained standing. The message, according to those familiar with the moment, was delivered plainly and without emotion. The royal family had weathered years of media pressure, internal disagreement and public scrutiny. But what was outlined in that room was seen as crossing into territory that could not be handled through patience alone. It required action, and quickly. This was no longer about public image, media spin, or personal disputes. It was about two children reportedly left in legal and emotional uncertainty. Inside the red folder were documents gathered over several days by different departments working separately, then cross-checked together. Education records, medical notices, legal correspondence. Each category alone raised eyebrows. Combined, they created a picture that reportedly left the room stunned. The first section focused on school status. It confirmed what had already set off alerts in California. The children had reportedly been withdrawn without formal notice. No transfer destination was listed. No alternative education plan had been filed. Even more concerning, written instructions from Meghan Markle's legal representatives were said to have been sent to several institutions, directing them to halt communication with royal education liaisons. That move added another layer of tension. The second section addressed medical care. Routine pediatric appointments for both children had been abruptly cancelled, not postponed, not rescheduled, cancelled outright. No follow-up providers were identified, no continuity referrals, no emergency explanation attached. In safeguarding language, officials reportedly viewed this as a serious disruption in continuity of care, but it was the financial documents that reportedly changed the energy in the room completely. An education trust fund, long established and valued at approximately £6.3 million, had originally been created to support the children's future schooling connected to the United Kingdom. According to the documents presented, that trust had been formally dissolved. For those present, that development raised immediate and difficult questions about long-term planning and oversight. The paperwork was reportedly finalized, the funds had been redirected, there was no clear record showing that replacement educational provisions had been set up. For experienced palace advisors, that raised a tough question. Why close down a child's established education fund while they were also being withdrawn from school? That combination did not look random.
Great name. And that was in the 90s. So what were the big shows and things that were on then? Baywatch. And so it was like Carmen Electra, Jenny and I see Yasmin Bleeth. And I cannot believe I'm seeing Yasmin Bleeth. And I'm holding this bag of trash. And I was like, the courage that it took for me to go up to her, and I said, hi, I love you in this soft and dry deodorant commercial. All that could come out of my mouth. Mm-hmm. And she was so gracious. This was such a pivotal moment for me because I never knew I was going to become an actor. This moment was so influential for me because she turned around and she goes, hi, sweetheart, what's your name? First thing I learned. I was like, I'm Meghan. And that moment, I was like, she cares to know what my name is.
The final document in the folder was described as an intelligence assessment dated January 29th. Marked privileged and confidential, it had been prepared by the Royal Intelligence Advisory Group. Unlike the earlier records, this one did not simply list actions, it focused on interpreted intent. That shift in tone made the room even quieter. According to the assessment, Meghan Markle had reportedly spent several months restructuring her professional and personal arrangements in a way analysts described as full strategic separation. The memo cited contracts, formal correspondence and planning materials as part of its review. Among the referenced items was a non-disclosure agreement involving a Dubai-based media financier. The agreement reportedly included language about removing prior family affiliations ahead of a planned independent brand launch. Phrases such as personal reinvention and narrative separation were highlighted in the summary. There were also communications declining participation in Prince Harry's proposed joint custody framework. Officials reviewing the material reportedly viewed these developments as significant, not because professional independence is unusual, but because of the timing alongside education, medical, and financial shifts. When placed together, those moves created a sequence that demanded immediate attention and serious review. One draft reportedly showed a clear refusal to commit to co-parenting arrangements beyond what was strictly required by court order. That detail alone raised tension, but what followed carried even more weight. Internal contracts connected to Archewell operations were reviewed. According to the documents, instructions had been issued to remove references to Archie and Lilibet from certain future Spotify and Netflix materials by mid-2026. Their names, their images, their presence phased out. For those inside the room, the implication felt direct. This was not viewed as a short-term step back. It was interpreted as a broader restructuring of identity and branding that reduced the children's public association while maintaining personal independence. One legal advisor reportedly summarized the concern in stark terms, stating, "This is not co-parenting. This is erasure." At that point, the discussion reportedly stopped being theoretical. Princess Anne did not open the floor for extended debate. She moved to action. Duchess Sophie of Edinburgh was instructed to initiate emergency custodial safeguard procedures without delay. A formal case file documenting what was described as alleged maternal disengagement was opened immediately. The documentation was prepared for submission to both the Royal Chancery Court in the United Kingdom and the California Family Court under shared jurisdiction protocols. Parallel legal pathways were reportedly set in motion at the same time, designed to prevent procedural delays or gaps. Shortly after, when Prince William arrived, he was handed the same red folder. The weight of its contents did not need explanation. The gravity was already clear. Witnesses later said he read the folder in complete silence, page after page, no interruptions, no visible reaction. When he reached the final document, he finally looked up and spoke once. "This is no longer about her. It is about protecting two children emotionally, legally, and historically." That sentence reportedly shaped everything that came next. From that moment forward, the Crown was no longer just responding, it was preparing to step in. After the red folder was closed, the energy inside Windsor changed. This was no longer about interpretation or speculation. The paperwork had already addressed the most pressing question facing senior officials. The concern was not simply whether Meghan Markle had reduced her public parenting role. It was whether she had been preparing for a complete departure from structured responsibility, not just stepping back from duties, but separating from long-standing institutional ties. Advisors began repeating a word that carries serious weight within royal governance: intent. In safeguarding reviews, intent can matter more than appearances. Mistakes can be corrected, miscommunication can be resolved, but if actions appear coordinated and strategic, officials are obligated to assess them differently. That distinction raised the stakes immediately. The January 29th intelligence assessment became central to the conversation. Unlike court filings or welfare updates, it did not focus on isolated decisions. It outlined what analysts described as a sequence. Over several months, there appeared to be a steady reduction of visible association. First, public references to the children reportedly became less frequent. Then, formal structures connected to education, healthcare, and financial planning shifted. Viewed separately, each move could be explained. Viewed together, they formed a pattern that officials believed required immediate and careful intervention. Mentions in external communications reportedly declined over time. Family-centered branding softened, then slowly disappeared. The shift was subtle, not dramatic enough to spark headlines, but steady enough to be detected by internal monitoring systems. That consistency is what caught attention. Then came contractual restructuring. Correspondence reviewed by advisors showed negotiations with a Dubai-based media financier. The focus was described as building a personal brand separate from any broader family narrative. Draft agreements highlighted themes of autonomy, reinvention, and separation from previous public associations. One clause reportedly requested the removal of historical identifiers that could link future projects to royal lineage. That detail alone raised eyebrows. What followed strengthened concerns about long-term direction. In internal communications, Meghan Markle declined participation in Prince Harry's proposed joint custody framework. The language, according to summaries, was formal and procedural. It focused on limiting structured coordination and reducing obligations to what was strictly required under court authority. Legal experts reviewing the material interpreted this as signaling distance rather than collaborative planning.
At the same time, Archewell-related documents reportedly outlined steps to adjust upcoming media content. Instructions were said to have been circulated to prevent Archie and Lilibet's names or likenesses from appearing in certain future Spotify or Netflix productions. For advisors examining the broader pattern, this was not viewed as a single branding choice. It appeared aligned with other structural changes happening simultaneously. Individually, each document might have seemed administrative. Together, they pointed toward a strategic repositioning that demanded careful legal and safeguarding review. After mid-2026, no clear replacement narrative was outlined in the reviewed materials. No transitional messaging, no public explanation of long-term plans. To some advisors, it appeared as though the children's visibility was gradually being reduced. What reportedly unsettled officials most was not ambition or independence, it was timing. These branding and contractual shifts aligned closely with reported changes to education and medical arrangements that had structured the children's daily lives. School enrollment withdrawn, healthcare continuity disrupted, public references reduced. When placed side by side, those developments felt bigger than simple career evolution. One palace official later described the realization as a moment of sharp clarity. In their view, the Crown was no longer observing a routine custody disagreement. It was confronting what some internally feared could become long-term disengagement if left unchecked. Language inside briefings reportedly became more direct. Terms such as maternal disengagement, identity displacement, and emotional severance began appearing in summaries. Within royal safeguarding protocol, once that threshold of concern is reached, escalation procedures are triggered. Princess Anne authorized Duchess Sophie of Edinburgh to initiate emergency custodial safeguard measures. This mechanism exists for a specific reason: to intervene if a royal child's legal or historical continuity appears at risk due to action or inaction by a guardian. The step was not presented as punishment, it was framed as protective containment. A formal case file was opened immediately, documenting reported withdrawal patterns, communication blocks, and preparatory restructuring. From that point forward, the situation moved out of quiet monitoring and into structured legal response. The tone was firm, the objective was stability, and the window for delay had officially closed. The case file was reportedly built to stand up under both United Kingdom and California family law standards. Parallel jurisdiction meant there would be no procedural gaps, no easy loopholes, no confusion over authority. Time was critical. Within hours, the Royal Chancery Court was notified. The California Family Court, responsible for overseeing the children's welfare, was alerted as well. Both courts were informed that the Crown was prepared to request emergency measures if conditions showed further instability. Prince Harry, according to sources, was briefed only after the legal structure had already been outlined.
While his role as a father remained emotionally important, advisors reportedly viewed the situation through a legal lens. Concerns were raised about unresolved residency questions, financial pressures, and whether there was sufficient independent infrastructure to immediately assume full guardianship responsibilities if required. The assessment was described as practical, not personal. The internal calculation became direct. Two children could not remain caught between reported disengagement on one side and structural uncertainty on the other. They needed consistency, they needed clarity, they needed protective systems that did not rely on shifting circumstances or informal agreements. Stability had to be formalized. When Prince William reviewed the intelligence assessment in full, discussions narrowed to one core issue. How far was the Crown prepared to proceed to secure long-term continuity? The response, according to those present, came without hesitation. This was not about managing headlines. It was not about shaping media narratives. It was about safeguarding identity within an institution that carries both responsibility and legacy. And in that framework, officials believed decisive action was no longer optional. One advisor reportedly said it straight. If the Crown failed to act now, it risked becoming complicit in long-term damage to the children's institutional identity. That assessment removed any remaining hesitation. From that point on, the process shifted from review to execution. Legal tools that had not been used in years were revisited. Historical precedents were pulled from archives. Emergency clauses drafted decades earlier were carefully re-examined and prepared for possible activation. The Crown was preparing for a step it had avoided for generations, assuming direct structural responsibility if necessary. And insiders suggested that if this line was crossed, it would not be symbolic. There would be no half measures, no extended negotiation phase, only formal action. The turning point came quietly. No public statement, no televised debate, no attempt to frame the moment softly. Once officials concluded that evidence pointed toward deliberate disengagement, the constitutional machinery began moving with controlled precision. Prince William returned to Windsor under what sources described as urgent conditions. Soon after, an emergency session of the Royal Advisory Council was convened behind closed doors. Attendance was tightly limited. Senior constitutional advisors, child welfare specialists, select members of the Privy Council authorized under emergency protocol. Every person in that room had decision-making authority.
This was not an open discussion circle. It was a decision chamber. The central issue placed before the council was clear and direct. Were Archie and Lilibet facing a level of legal or structural displacement serious enough to justify direct royal intervention? The weight of that question hung heavy in the room. Because once answered, the path forward would be immediate, formal, and impossible to quietly reverse. The evidence was reviewed one final time. Education withdrawn without a documented continuity plan. Medical oversight reportedly interrupted. Financial safeguards dismantled. Strategic preparations that appeared to distance the children from both institutional and public identity. Communication barriers, and a secondary guardian described as not yet positioned to provide immediate structural stability. When all of it was placed together, the pattern felt undeniable. There was no recorded dissent inside the council. The agreement was unanimous. Advisors concluded that the safeguarding threshold had been crossed. At that moment, Prince William moved to invoke a rarely used constitutional provision, internally referred to as Appendix 4 of the Royal Succession Stabilization Framework. The clause allows the Crown to assume temporary guardianship authority if royal minors are believed to face identity displacement, legal abandonment, or measurable emotional risk linked to custodial breakdown. This was not ceremonial language. It carried operational force. Within hours, coordinated protective steps were initiated across jurisdictions.
The children's passports were placed under immediate security restriction, preventing international travel without dual authorization from Princess Anne and the Crown's Child Welfare Council. Officials emphasized that the step was not punitive. It was described as containment, designed to maintain stability while legal proceedings advanced. At the same time, an image protection order was enacted under the Windsor Privacy Act, structured to remain in effect for 5 years. The purpose was to regulate commercial or public use of the children's likenesses during ongoing review. Together, these measures signaled a dramatic shift. The Crown had moved from observation to direct intervention. And once that machinery is activated, it does not pause easily. Any commercial or promotional use of the children's names, likenesses, or personal narratives was immediately restricted without explicit Crown authorization. Streaming platforms, publishers, and licensing partners were formally notified through legal channels. The signal was direct and firm. The children were not business assets. They were minors under institutional protection. Then came the countermeasure. Prince William authorized the creation of a Royal Restoration Fund, reportedly valued at £12 million. The purpose was not image management, it was structured recovery. The fund was designated for emotional support, educational continuity, and long-term reintegration within a secure framework. Specialists in cross-cultural identity development and child psychology were retained to guide stabilization efforts. Educational planners were assigned to rebuild academic structure carefully, aiming to avoid further disruption. Officials emphasized that this was not a short-term patch. It was a long-range strategy focused on consistency and safeguarding. Stability first, optics second. During this period, Prince Harry submitted a request seeking temporary custodial authority. According to multiple sources, the application was reviewed quickly and declined within hours. The reasoning provided was described as procedural rather than personal. Advisors cited unresolved residency matters, travel constraints due to passport restrictions, and questions about whether sufficient independent infrastructure was in place to meet heightened safeguarding standards. The response was delivered without public commentary. By nightfall, formal guardianship authority and protective oversight regarding the Windsor children rested solely under Crown protocol. The shift was complete. Legal, financial, and institutional control had consolidated under one framework. From that point forward, the message was clear. Stability would be managed at the highest constitutional level, and every move would be documented, deliberate, and tightly controlled. The operation was finalized, systems were secured, orders were formally filed. External partners received quiet legal notification. There were no leaks, no press conferences, no dramatic headlines pushed from inside the palace. That lack of spectacle was intentional. For the monarchy, this was not about flexing power. It was framed as carrying out institutional duty. One senior advisor later summarized the moment with calm seriousness, saying the Crown did not remove the children. It intervened because responsibility required it. Still, those inside Windsor understood something critical. This was not the end of tension. It was the start of a far more unpredictable chapter. Authority had been consolidated, but one central figure remained outside the newly activated structure. Meghan Markle had not issued a response. In the hours after the Crown's intervention, formal requests for clarification were sent through legal representatives. According to sources, those communications were acknowledged, then left without substantive reply. Draft public statements were reportedly written, revised, and ultimately never released. What followed was silence, complete and deliberate. For palace officials, that absence carried weight. In high-level legal matters, silence can shape perception as strongly as open opposition. There was no public denial, no challenge filed immediately, no counter-statement explaining next steps, just stillness. As the legal safeguards took effect, ripple effects began extending beyond Windsor's walls. Contracts adjusted, media partners recalibrated, institutional protections locked into place. Inside the palace, discipline and restraint guided every move. Outside it,
Uncertainty grew louder by the hour.
Because in crises like this, action makes noise, but silence can shake the ground even more. International partners were formally notified of the Image Protection Directive. Streaming platforms reportedly updated internal compliance systems without public announcements. References to the children were quietly removed from certain archive descriptions, promotional materials, and future development outlines. There was no press release explaining the adjustments. The changes simply appeared in back-end systems, and the names were no longer present. Behind the scenes, financial regulators in multiple jurisdictions initiated precautionary reviews and temporary freezes on selected accounts connected to holding entities tied to Meghan Markle's media ventures. These steps were described as protective, not punitive. The trigger was ongoing uncertainty around custodial authority and the potential commercial use of minors' identities while legal oversight was being clarified. Sponsorship discussions linked to family-oriented storytelling concepts reportedly stalled. Some negotiations paused indefinitely. What had once been described publicly as strategic reinvention began, in the eyes of some observers, to resemble isolation from prior institutional frameworks. At the same time, media outlets published images placing Meghan aboard a luxury yacht in Doha, photographed alongside a Middle Eastern media investor. To casual viewers, the scenes projected confidence and independence. To officials already reviewing the broader timeline, the images underscored physical and professional distance during a critical legal window. Notably, according to palace briefings, no immediate formal objection was filed against the guardianship measures. No urgent appeal was submitted in the earliest phase when procedural challenges might have carried more weight. There were no public filings demanding reversal. Inside royal circles, that continued absence of direct legal pushback was interpreted as significant, because in moments when authority shifts rapidly, timing can change everything. And when that window closes, influence narrows just as fast. The contrast did not go unnoticed. While institutional systems were mobilized to stabilize two young lives, the primary parent of record was reportedly unreachable. Prince Harry, however, was present and actively engaged. Sources close to him said he was shocked by how quickly and decisively the Crown moved. He believed that once custody agreements were signed, they created lasting protection. He believed compromise would hold the line. That assumption did not match the outcome. When he submitted a request for temporary custodial authority, the response came back fast and formal. Advisors cited unresolved U.S. residency status, complex travel restrictions tied to passport controls, overlapping jurisdictional oversight, and financial pressures that raised safeguarding questions. These were described internally as procedural hurdles, not personal criticism. Still, they carried weight. The message delivered to him was direct and unemotional. Guardianship requires structure. Structure requires verified capacity. At that moment, officials concluded the threshold had not been met. The notification letter was delivered by royal courier. It included no added commentary, no reassurance, no apology. Under the terms outlined, custody, guardianship, and protective oversight of the Windsor children would remain under Crown protocol until further legal review. Any future access would be conditional, supervised, and subject to ongoing assessment under safeguarding standards. For Prince Harry, the realization was heavy. The authority he once assumed came naturally with fatherhood and status had shifted into institutional hands. Decisions were no longer his to make independently. The structure had closed around the situation. And inside that structure, every next step would be measured, documented, and controlled at the highest constitutional level. He had become an observer, and as these changes unfolded, another quiet shift took place inside the palace. Responsibility for the children's day-to-day emotional support was formally reassigned. Princess Catherine stepped into a stabilizing role that required no headline, no ceremony. She adjusted her schedule. Child development specialists were retained. A trusted caregiver with experience in cross-cultural identity guidance was reassigned to support Lilibet directly. The approach was intentional and low-key. No staged appearances, no dramatic gestures for cameras. Stability was rebuilt through routine, consistency, and familiar faces. Bedtimes, school preparation, familiar faces. The kind of rhythm children rely on when everything else feels uncertain. One carefully chosen moment, however, carried quiet symbolism. A single photograph was released without caption or detailed statement. It showed Lilibet walking out of Windsor Chapel, holding Princess Charlotte's hand. There were no quotes attached, no press briefing to explain it. To the general public, it looked warm and simple. To those aware of the legal backdrop, it signaled something stronger. The children were not drifting, they were under visible protection. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle's legal representatives later issued a brief statement referencing privacy concerns and ongoing proceedings. The wording was measured and restrained. It did not address specific safeguarding actions. It did not comment directly on the children's current arrangements. It focused strictly on legal process. Inside Windsor, the response was calm but firm. Officials viewed the absence of detailed objection as significant. In high-level custodial disputes, silence can carry meaning, especially during early procedural windows.
Guardianship had been secured. Protective systems were in place, but final legal judgment had not yet been delivered. The next phase would not play out through photographs or symbolism. It would unfold in courtrooms, filings, and formal review. And until that process concluded, every move would remain deliberate, documented, and tightly controlled at the highest level. While legal authority tightened and formal control consolidated, another process began inside the palace. It did not unfold in courtrooms or through sealed orders. It was quieter, slower, and in many ways more important. Officials understood that guardianship alone could not repair disruption. Protection without belonging is just containment, and containment is not enough for children finding their footing. What was needed now was not only security, but continuity, a steady reminder that their lives were more than case files and institutional concern. That responsibility was placed carefully in the hands of the next generation of senior royals. Within days of the guardianship transition, Princess Anne authorized a set of understated measures aimed at restoring emotional balance. There were no public announcements, no leaked calendars. Each adjustment was introduced as though it were routine, even though the circumstances were anything but normal. Lilibet was gently integrated into a structured daily rhythm inside Windsor. Lessons resumed without fanfare. Playtime returned without cameras. Familiar routines replaced the unpredictability that had surrounded previous weeks. The focus was not strict discipline. It was reassurance, predictability, calm. Princess Catherine personally oversaw the coordination. Her involvement was active, not ceremonial. She worked closely with child psychologists experienced in navigating identity disruption and cultural transitions. Her guiding principle was clear: consistency over intensity, stability over spectacle, normalcy over narrative. Inside the palace, the goal was simple but powerful: make the children feel anchored again, not through grand gestures, but through everyday life done right. Because when everything else feels uncertain, routine becomes a lifeline. The goal was never to sit a child down and explain a crisis in adult terms. It was to remove the feeling that life itself had tilted off balance. Those close to the process described Princess Catherine's method as controlled restraint. No dramatics, no emotional pressure, no staged bonding moments, just steady presence, calm, predictable. Then came Princess Charlotte's role. The decision to involve her was not rushed. It was carefully reviewed with senior advisors and child development specialists. Charlotte was not asked to act as a symbol. She was not told to represent unity or continuity. She was simply encouraged to be herself, a cousin, a familiar face, family. The two girls were brought together gradually through everyday routines instead of formal introductions. Shared meals, walks in the garden, quiet afternoons where conversation was optional. No cameras watching, no expectations hanging in the air. Just space. What developed was natural. Charlotte, already comfortable within royal structure, became a quiet source of stability. Not through authority, not through explanation, through familiarity. There was no hierarchy emphasized, no heavy conversations forced, just companionship unfolding at its own pace. One palace aide later remarked that this stage mattered more than any legal document. Authority can be signed into place overnight. Emotional trust cannot. It builds slowly through repetition and safety. As the days passed, subtle changes were noticed. Lilibet's anxiety reportedly eased. Sleep patterns steadied. Drawings that once appeared unsettled began to soften in tone and color. It was not dramatic, it was gradual, and that was the point. Stability doesn't shout, it settles in quietly and stays. These observations were documented privately by child development professionals. They were never released publicly. Inside Windsor, a quiet belief began to settle in. Something fragile had been steadied before it could break. That realization shaped the next move carefully and strategically. On the morning of Candlemas Eve, Kensington Palace released a single photograph. No statement, no caption, no explanation attached. The image showed Lilibet and Princess Charlotte walking out of Windsor Chapel hand in hand. To casual viewers, it looked sweet and simple, just two young girls leaving a service together. But to those tracking every development, it carried weight. It signaled continuity. It suggested that structure and belonging had been restored. The message was not about winning. It was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about inheritance in its deeper meaning. Not titles, not wealth, but place, identity, family connection. Advisors later pointed out the precision of the timing. The photograph appeared as legal filings intensified across jurisdictions, as speculation surged, as online narratives began stretching beyond verified fact. The Crown did not respond with interviews, it did not argue through statements. It answered with an image rooted in stability. Two children steady, one future visibly anchored. And in that moment, the tone of the entire situation shifted. The focus moved away from adult decisions and towards institutional responsibility. This was no longer framed as a debate about personal choices. It became a question of safeguarding within a system that views children not as side effects of conflict, but as its absolute boundary.
When that boundary is tested, the response is firm, quiet, and final. The next phase unfolded through legal procedure, not emotion. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices echoing through a packed courtroom. When the ruling arrived, it came in the controlled, formal manner institutions prefer for serious matters. Quiet, structured, final in tone. On the morning of February 1st, the court convened under restricted conditions. Proceedings were brief, arguments were limited, as documentation had already been submitted and reviewed in depth. According to court summaries, Meghan Markle was not present. Her legal representatives confirmed she would not take part in the hearing. That absence was noted formally in the record. The judgment that followed marked a significant legal shift. The court ruled that custodial authority would be reassigned under Crown-supervised guardianship structures. The decision referenced documented disengagement, interruption of welfare coordination, and disruption of educational and medical continuity. In legal phrasing, it was characterized as abandonment through omission rather than direct action. That distinction carried weight. Within hours of the ruling, Princess Anne delivered a brief public statement from St. James's Palace. The tone was measured and restrained. She did not dramatize the outcome. She framed it as a matter of safeguarding duty and institutional responsibility. In her words, any formal custodial influence previously exercised would now operate solely within Crown protocol and court oversight. There were no extended remarks, no commentary beyond the ruling, just clarity. The judgment did not arrive with spectacle, it arrived with authority. And once entered into record, it reshaped the legal landscape completely. Following the ruling, the Crown clarified that all custodial authority would operate strictly under court-approved guardianship protocol. Any previously exercised parental privileges were now subject to judicial oversight. Officials emphasized that the children's welfare must be guided by legal duty and structured protection, not personal ambition or external influence. There was no immediate formal rebuttal issued through U.S. courts. In the days that followed, a series of institutional adjustments took place. Trust structures established outside direct royal supervision were reviewed and, where necessary, suspended pending compliance checks. Financial vehicles referencing the children's names were reassessed under existing Windsor governance agreements. Commercial contracts tied to Archie or Lilibet were either amended or terminated to align with the updated custodial framework. The children's identities were placed under comprehensive legal protection, limiting licensing, branding, or monetization without Crown and court approval. Officials framed the move as preventative, not punitive. One of the most decisive measures involved travel status. Under an established sovereign guardianship provision, Prince William authorized that both children's passports be held under secure custodial oversight until adulthood. International travel would require direct authorization consistent with court and Crown protocol. The action was described internally as preservation of jurisdictional clarity. At the same time, coordination between the Foreign Office and child welfare authorities ensured that all outstanding legal documentation in California reflected the new guardianship structure. A small administrative team was dispatched to finalize compliance reviews and confirm that residual agreements were formally closed where required. As these measures unfolded, photographs surfaced showing Meghan Markle in Doha, attending private gatherings linked to media and investment circles. The images circulated briefly before fading from headlines. Her legal representatives issued a short statement challenging jurisdictional scope and reiterating privacy concerns. By then, however, the institutional framework had solidified. The Crown's position was no longer reactive, it was operational, structured, and firmly embedded within legal record. The final statement issued on Meghan Markle's behalf made no direct reference to the children. It did not challenge the court's ruling. It did not outline a path back into structured custodial involvement. Within royal circles, that silence was interpreted as acceptance of the legal reality. Meanwhile, several high-profile supporters began stepping back. Public endorsements cooled, planned collaborations slowed, a proposed podcast relaunch was quietly paused after focus group feedback described the tone as emotionally distant and lacking authenticity. Momentum that once felt unstoppable began to thin out. Prince Harry also retreated from public life. Appearances were cancelled, invitations declined. Those close to him described someone processing shock and deep frustration, trying to understand how authority had shifted so quickly beyond his influence. Still, the Crown did not describe its actions as punishment. In a formal clarification from the Privy Council, the position was direct. The monarchy is not correcting individuals, it is correcting course. Responsibility for Archie and Lilibet now rests with Princess Anne, Prince William, Princess Catherine, and Prince Edward in their roles as named trustees under the updated guardianship framework. Their mandate is focused and clear: protection, stability, continuity. Inside Windsor, daily life moved forward. Lessons resumed, meals were shared, gardens were walked, extraordinary circumstances were folded quietly into routine. There were no public celebrations, no declarations of victory, just structure, just care, just the steady message that children connected to a constitutional legacy will be safeguarded through it.
Yet one thread remains unanswered. Why did Prince Harry raise serious accusations only after custodial authority had already shifted? Why did certain claims surface at the moment control slipped away? Those questions remain part of the broader story. What is clear is this: the Crown acted. Legal authority has been settled. The children are under formal protection. But the deeper truth behind the final rupture has yet to fully surface. If you've followed this entire breakdown, let me know your thoughts below. Do you believe the Crown had no choice, or do you see this differently? Drop a comment, share your perspective, and keep the conversation respectful. And if you want more deep dives like this, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who are watching this story.